Hello and welcome to the program. 1 year ago, Belarusian journalist Pavel Sheremet was murdered in broad daylight in the center of Kiev. He was on the way to present his regular morning radio show when an explosive device was detonated under his car. His murder was the most high-profile killing of a journalist in Ukraine since 2000, when the remains of investigative reporter Grigory Godsey were discovered on the outskirts of Kiev. Now, the Ukrainian authorities are under huge pressure to find out who orchestrated the murder of Pavel Sheremet, the investigative reporter. Joining us via Skype from London is Alan Rusbridger. He is on the board of directors at the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's also the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello.
So 1 year on, how alarming is it that there has not been a single suspect identified in the murder of Pavel Sheremet? And what do you think are the chances of authorities conducting a fair and comprehensive investigation into the murder?
Well, I think any time a journalist is murdered in a democracy, it's alarming. And it's even more alarming if they can't find the killer. Now, this is clearly a complex case, and no one's pretending it's an easy case to solve. But I think what was alarming was that some of Pavel's colleagues, former colleagues, did their own investigation and came up with quite significant evidence that the police and investigating authorities had missed. And that, I think, calls into question just how thorough this investigation has been.
I think the movie Killing Pavel that the CPJ, I believe your organization, helped work together with Ukrainian journalists to investigate, to conduct an investigation into the investigation going on. And a member of the European Parliament, Rebecca Harms, has recently commented on the film on the anniversary of Pavel Sheremet's murder. She said that the murder has, quote, gone cold, based on the organization's findings in the film. And she continues saying this is highly worrisome. And so how important has and will be the role of investigative journalists in finding the perpetrators in this murder case?
Well, I think they have done brilliant work. And it was surprising to us when we were in Ukraine last week to compare the work on that film with some of the work done by the police. Now, of course, the police say they've done a lot more work that they can't yet talk about, but they admitted that the journalists and their work, particularly looking at the CCTV footage and doing forensic analysis of the images, gave them leads that they had missed. So I think that the question in everybody's mind must be that it is at least possible that a state player was responsible for the murder of Sheremet, because of something that he wrote or was looking at. And any time that you have the state investigating itself, as it were, people are bound to have questions about whether that can ever be a proper investigation.
Despite these strong comments coming from Western politicians, including Rebecca Harms, what kind of an impact does the CPJ's findings have had on the investigation, considering that there are forces within Ukraine which seem to be slowing down the investigation and perhaps even trying to stop it altogether?
Well, I think Ukraine wants to be seen as a modern country. It wants to be seen as a democracy. It obviously wants a place in Europe. And it can't be seen as any of those things if journalists are murdered with impunity on its streets and if there is no proper investigation. So when we were there in Kiev last week, we met with the president and with the police and with the intelligence services and with the prosecutor. And I hope that our presence there signaled that the rest of the world is looking at this case and wants a result.
Right. Does the CPJ, the organization which is working to protect journalists, does it have any initiatives which will essentially support Ukrainian investigative reporters who are going to continue their work into Pavel Sheremet's murder?
No, we're not that kind of organization. We can investigate investigations and we can hold up a mirror to what's going on, but we don't have the resources to investigate ourselves. But I think what alarmed me was the climate of fear that this murder has caused amongst Ukrainian journalists. And some of them we spoke to admitted that they were now less aggressive in their reporting and that they were now not publishing things that they would have published a year ago. And maybe that was the intention of the killers, to frighten all Ukrainian journalists. And an organization like CPJ can at least say, look, the world is with you, you're not alone, and we will be watching and drawing attention to the state of affairs in Ukraine.
Right. Now, speaking about, how this has created, cultivated even a climate of fear among reporters here in Ukraine. I read your powerful article titled An Unsolved Murder, where you say that Pavel represented the best of journalism. Now, why is that?
Well, everyone we spoke to about him said that he was trusted, he was warm, he was compassionate, he was accurate. He believed in a factual basis for journalism. He was as good as journalism gets, and that's why people wanted to speak to him. That's why he had so many friends in politics. And so it's doubly tragic when somebody who represents the best that journalists can be is murdered in this way. So it was very touching hearing about him because he was clearly so admired.
Now, why is it so imperative for ordinary Ukrainians to find out who killed Pavel Sheremet?
Well, journalists are not the only people who can establish facts, but at our best, and as we've been discussing, Sheremet was as good as it gets. They're very good. And society needs facts. We look at America at the moment with the president talking about alternative facts and denouncing fake news in the New York Times. And you realize how frightening it is to live in a society where you can't tell what's true and what isn't true, what's a fact and what isn't a fact. And former Soviet countries know that better than anybody. So you do need reliable information. And in societies where the messenger gets killed, that's a bad thing, and it really needs, ordinary Ukrainians ought to really worry about the impunity of allowing whoever it was to get away with that kind of murder.
Now, going back to how this is the second high-profile killing of an investigative reporter in 2000, almost 2 decades ago, Grigory Godsey was murdered. His remains were found on the outskirts of Kiev, and only in 2016 a top police officer was charged for and jailed for his killing. He swore that he was simply carrying out orders from above, and he said high-level officials ordered him to kill Grigory Godsey. Now, do you see a similar scenario playing out in the case of Pavel Sheremet as well, where high-ranking officials who those who orchestrated the murder will never be tried in court?
Well, I hope not. And the police and the president himself mentioned the Godsey case, and it was clearly a shameful thing that happened, and it took so long for anybody to get a lead on that. And they all said they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of that case, and they were determined to get to the bottom. So I think that was a very unhappy episode in Ukraine's history. And if you believe the police and the president, they really don't want anybody to make comparisons with that case today. And
you just mentioned that you spoke with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. What were some of the pledges, or what did he promise with this case to you?
Well, I think the main thing that came out of that meeting was that he was keen to have an external scrutiny on the investigation. So he said, look, if you can find a bona fide investigator, probably a policeman or retired police officer from another country who could join the investigation, then he would welcome that. And I think that is that's a good offer, and it signals that he at least doesn't want anything to be covered up in this investigation.
And do you have plans to reveal the name of a potentially retired police officer that you would suggest to help with the investigation?
Well, we are behind the scenes. We're continuing to consult on that, and of course, it's very much for the family and Pavel's former colleagues to be satisfied that we've got the right person who could do that. But I think if you got the right person, and hopefully the Ukrainian police would welcome this, some external advice and scrutiny and oversight of the investigation.
Right, I see. So now, you mentioned earlier that when you spoke to a lot of the Ukrainian journalists, there was a lot of talk about how they were feeling they couldn't go after the stories that they really truly wanted to pursue because of Pavel Sheremet's murder. Now, many Ukrainians, I think, are facing a difficult task as it is, and on reporting on the conflict in the country. Now, how does a journalist's role change when they have to report on a war in their own country? Well, I think it's difficult because there's always going to be a conflict between, or an apparent conflict between your instincts as somebody who is a patriot and somebody who is a journalist. But in the end, journalism has to be independent of the state. And sometimes the best service that a journalist can do is to criticize and hold to account his or her country at a time of war. So I don't see really a conflict between being a journalist and being a patriot. And if you're fighting for anything, you're fighting for the values of freedom and liberty. And those values apply in wartime as in peace. I see. Well, thank you very, very much. Some wise words for a lot of the journalists working here in Ukraine. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm very happy to mark this sad day of Pavel's anniversary by having this conversation. Thank you so much. And that has been Mr. Alan Rusbridger. He is on the board of directors at the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's also the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. We've been speaking about the investigation into the murder of Pavel Sheremet. You're watching UATV.